Hello, everyone. Welcome to Consumer Goods Technology. I'm Lisa Johnston, the managing editor of CGT, and I'm here today talking with John Lash of E2open about supply chain planning. John, welcome. Why don't you get us started by telling us a little bit about yourself and about E2open?
Okay, so super great. Thank you so much, Lisa. So my name is John Lash. I head up product marketing at E2open, and we're a supply chain management company. We're the largest 100% software as a service supply chain planning company. So really excited to be here.
Great, thank you. So now, trying to predict demand during the pandemic has been challenging for consumer goods brands, to say the least. From your perspective, though, what's changed from the early days of the pandemic versus, more recently? What kind of impact has this second wave had?
Yeah, well, I guess overall, it's been a really turbulent ride, right? If you think of from demand and supply perspective, right? Think of like just with demand, right? Toilet paper, sanitizers, canned goods, yeast, all that kind of stuff. And who can forget the empty aisles, right? Like I remember I was going to my local store and I've seen some empty shelves before, but this was the entire aisle all the way down, totally empty, right? So you had these demand shocks that are going up. There's demand down. So think of food service companies, right? And slower moving, all these slow moving goods that people turn to the staples. So what happens to all of those? Like even yesterday on the news, there was talk about an article about shoes, right? And no one's buying shoes, especially ones where you're got to be in the office, right? So all of these behaviors, they shifted from a demand side, a shock up, a shock down. There was also supply surpluses, right? From the supply side, you had these shocks with dumped milk, you had plowed vegetables, you had, do you remember oil at minus $37 a barrel, right? No one wanted to take it. There was a glut on the market and there was nowhere to put it. So it was minus 37, totally unprecedented. And then of course you got, from a shortage perspective, your PPE and you had nationalism kicking in, you had all these things. So all these different shocks from a demand side, from a supply side, and I'd say overall, especially on the consumer side of things, consumer packaged goods, it's really the demand side of it was even more impactful than supply. And, this changing behaviors happened at unprecedented scale, super hard to go and predict. And, when you think of these crises, right? There are all these crises management models to go and help companies go and manage each different stage. And there are typically three stages. There's the response, there's the recovery, and then there's the reset. Response where you're just trying to go and make stuff happen, right? And keep the lights on. And then there's recovery, you shift into a new normal and you try and figure that out. And then reset, where you take it to the next level and say, well, how do I prepare for the next time and really get better there? And so we did this study just recently, which is kind of like our forecasting benchmark study, which a number of your readers might be familiar with. That's an annual study on the state of the nation of forecasting. Well, we did it a version specifically for this COVID period to go and understand what the performance was in the study. And this is for manufacturers of essential services. And what we saw in the data where there were three phases. So it's just like those recovery models where we had this pre-pandemic stage. And then, from looking at the sales and the service data, we could see the onset coming in where people were going and reacting. And then this new normal coming out, or recovery. And so it was really in the mid-March timeframe when that onset happened, and then early May where we shifted into this new normal. And when we're looking at forecast accuracy and the challenges, like going back to your question about how easy it was for people to go and manage all of this. Well, we saw in there, compared to the pre-pandemic side, when people were in the panic buying and that immediate response, it went up to more than 40% higher forecast error than what the business as usual pre-pandemic. And then we shifted into this first wave recovery, which was 30% higher. So it's kind of like Jay Powell, the Fed chairman, said, it's the economy, it's recovering, but it's not recovering back to the same economy. And it's the same kind of thing here that we're seeing in the supply chain. It's recovering, but not back to the same kind of supply chain. It's harder now than it was before. And that continues on through the second wave and any other wave that's happening.
So then on that note, can you talk a little bit about some of the companies that are getting things right with demand planning, versus those that simply are not and that are really struggling?
Yeah, and I think in the response stage when it first happened, right, everyone was scrambling just to keep things going, right, and there were a lot of heroic efforts to keep people fed and safe, and I think it's really important to go and recognize all the people in supply chain that played a role in that, because we're on the front lines. A lot of people are on the front lines keeping us fed and safe and healthy. But throughout all this, it's been super hard to go and understand demand. So there's been this change in consumers, a huge change in the way consumers go and buy things. Like when the panic stage, remember when you were going and packing in your pantry at home and you were filling all sorts of things? You're basically building your own safety stock within your pantry, right? And then things go and change as it shifts through the different stages. And what's the risk level? How do I have to replenish that? What do I go? How do I change what I'm buying and what I'm bringing home? But then there's not just the what, there's also the how. How am I changing, or how am I buying these things now? And I don't know about you, but I've been to a store for months now. We have Imperfect Foods, where a box comes to our house. We do curbside pickup. So all of that is kind of shifted. And I heard on the news yesterday that actually Imperfect Foods, they got us $95 million in Series D funding. So I'm not the only one who's thinking this. There are a lot of people that are shifting the way that they're doing things. But what this means from that shift is that it's harder to do things. And there was harder to predict demand. And there was also one other element too, which is from a manufacturer side, is a lot of the manufacturers went and shifted their mix, right? So, toilet paper, a lot of people that's the one that we're all familiar with. Instead of having a 36 and a 24 and a 12 and a 6-pack, right? It's just to standardize on that. Let's do a SKU rationalization. We'll only make one version of it. Keep the factories running more efficiently, faster, improve the productivity, enhance that so that we can just get product out there and it will turn and sell. So there was a big rationalization that happened from a SKU perspective. So you've got the change in SKUs, you've got the change in buying behavior. All those changes, it makes it really hard to go and predict and what that demand is going to be. And that was reflected a little bit in those figures where we said 40% higher in forecast error during that response period, and even now 30% higher after we're in this new normal, right? So you might say to yourself, well, what can you do, or what can companies going to do when history's no good? And I guess one of the immediate things is like, what do you think would be more helpful for companies? So when you're just going off history that doesn't work anymore, or if you're using real-time data, which ones do you think would go and fare better, right? So that's really what one of the big shifts is. Companies that were able to use that information really did much better than those that didn't have that available.
Okay, so now building off that a little bit, what are some of the other technologies that today's most successful companies are using to develop a resilient supply chain?
Yeah, so when history goes out of the window, right? What can you do? What can help, right? And as I mentioned before, there's nothing better than to use some real-time data, because that gives you an indication not just of what you hope people will buy or what your gut feel says that they should be buying, or maybe you have no idea, but this actually goes and tells you what is actually happening right now, and then you can use this information to make better decisions. So that's using real-time data. It's going outside of your enterprise to get that information, because instead of just looking at signals inside, what if you could find out what's actually happening on the shelves and in the warehouses for your different retailer partners, for example? Those are really valuable signals to be able to go and use and to make better sense of what's happening. Now, the other really important technology to use alongside of this is AI. And you may say, well, why AI? It's because there's so much information with real-time data that you've got to be able to treat that differently. And you're using AI to manage all that information and to be able to extract patterns, extract what's happening, and to use that systematically. And during the pandemic, there was something really interesting that happened. There was a lot of concern expressed by different experts in the field that AI needs to have seen something before in order to deal with it now. And because the pandemic was unprecedented, they're going, well, AI's never seen that, so it's kind of risky, we should turn that off. Well, that turns out to be totally the wrong choice. It was really important, and in that study that I mentioned, we actually looked at the capabilities or what the forecast accuracy was if you used AI and real-time data compared to when you didn't, and you got a 30 to 35% reduction in forecast error across every one of those areas, the pre-pandemic, the onset where everyone was doing the panic buying, and then also the new normal. So that really just shows the power of being able to use it. So I would say, two really important things to go and start off with is real-time data, and then the second one is AI, and the third is go outside. So this is an end-to-end problem. It's not just on the demand side, but it's also on the supply side. And there are all sorts of stories about tier 3 suppliers going out of business and impacting your manufacturing. It's an end-to-end problem, and you want to be looking outside of your organization, downstream and upstream, and using this in combination to go and solve these problems. And this makes you really far more agile and far more resilient and able to withstand disruptions. And what we've seen from the study is it's not just any kind of disruption, even ones of the magnitude of a pandemic. So it's really effective, and there's been, in a way, the pandemic has served as the ultimate use case for how do you manage disruptions.
Yeah, and kind of on that note, one of the things we talk a lot about and we hear a lot about at CGT is the idea of the gap between the haves and the have-nots, right? The companies that had been investing in their supply chain resilience prior to the pandemic and those that hadn't. I think we've seen a lot of what's happened as a result of that. What I'd like to get your perspective on is, what risks do consumer goods companies face as this gap only widens?
Yeah, and there certainly is a gap. And I think the COVID-19 was a great wake-up call where CEOs are really, it's an acute realization that what they've been doing in the past, which was good enough for years, well, it's no longer good enough. And this is really making the business case for end-to-end visibility across multiple tiers. You're seeing it almost anywhere you look. And end-to-end visibility, it's always been, if you look on the user wants and needs, it's always been pretty high on the list for wants, but not enough on the needs to go and justify the business case to go and invest in it. And so this is really shifting. We've seen this big transfer of doing that. And it allows you to go and have more agility and resiliency. And the companies that were doing that before, well, they had an advantage, right? And they're in a much better position as they're going through the pandemic than those that didn't. And I think this is really, it's like I said, it's a great wake-up call to realize that if you haven't invested in those, you should get started in it, because using that real-time data, using that AI, looking end-to-end, having that visibility, using it to make better decisions, that's going to allow you to go and ride out these storms. So those that had it were better positioned to go and serve their clients and hopefully come out of some of this disruption stronger than they were when they went in, whereas some of their competitors are not, and a number of companies are going out of business, right? So it's this combination of making sure that you survive, and then two, being able to take advantage of any of the opportunities that come along throughout this disruption to advance. So it's that combination.
Okay, that's great advice, and I'm wondering if you could close us out with some best practices for CGs about developing supply chain resilience strategies.
Yeah, I think it goes back to our last point there, which is really get started, right? Get started now. You may say, oh, well, I should have had that before, but it's never too late. And there are going to be lots of other challenges facing us going forward. This isn't the last one. It's just been a really big one, and one that we're all very familiar with right now, and we're living through it. So get started right now. And if you're not using real-time data and AI to go and forecast demand, right, whether it's on the long-term horizons or short-term horizons, do it. It performs on all the horizons. So use this, but at the same time, really go and look for proven use cases and references for it, because there's a fair amount of snake oil, like people taking advantage of the situation out there. So really ask for those references and do things, but and talk to folks, look at resources like this, the study that we just kind of published that's fact-based. So take advantage of that, use those resources to understand and help build your business case. Start looking at end-to-end data, right? Most disruptions, they happen outside the four walls of your enterprise. So you want to understand what those disruptions and those impacts are, like for the pandemic or something else, how that impacts your demand side, how that impacts your supply side, how does it impact both of those in combination? So it's using that information allows you to be much better positioned for an agile and resilient supply chain. The other one is trust the data. We're going to very complex environments now. This is not like the supply chain of your grandfather's age, right? They're modern, complex supply chains that are global in nature with all sorts of different moving parts. And it's hard to run on gut feel, and it's hard to run on opinion. And there's this wonderful quote that's attributed to Steve Jobs. So many things are attributed, so who knows whether it's really true that he said this. But it's just so perfect, where it's going, if there's data, let's use the data. If it's just opinion, we'll use my opinion. And so that's not the right, like that ends up like that, but you don't want to be stuck in that opinion situation. Otherwise, it's just the person with the loudest voice or the biggest title that makes that decision, and it's probably not necessarily the right one for the business. So trust the data, get the data, use the data, trust the data, and that will give you a really big, important step ahead of everything else. So those are some of the thoughts. Real-time information, AI, end-to-end, and trust that data are some good places to go and begin.
Okay, well, thank you. That's definitely some good advice for us to close with. We are out of time. So thank you, John, for joining us, sharing your insight. Just a reminder, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to myself or to E2open. But for now, thank you for watching.